Hello and welcome to this online class on the Nazi state. We're continuing our study of who benefited from Nazi rule, who did not benefit from Nazi rule, and today we're going to focus on two groups. We're going to focus on, first of all, women and whether or not they benefited from life under the Nazis, and then we'll move on and look at young people, so women and youth. Now, except both of these groups, especially women, are not homogenous groups, right? There are variations, obviously, within the German population in the 1930s regarding women in terms of class and religion and whatnot, and therefore we will evaluate at the very end of this section as to whether or not all women were treated the same way by the Nazis. But I guess the Nazis did believe that women had a kind of biological purpose in life, and therefore that they should be treated the same way by the regime. But it's not as simplistic as that, as we will see. Now, part of the way that we've been looking at this topic is to focus on, did some groups benefit more so than others, right? And that's what I've just mentioned. How did women go on? How did young people go on? But in addition to that, we also have to focus on the other question. Did groups benefit from the Nazis because of policies? Were there certain policies that definitely 100%, you could say benefited women or young people? Or was the regime much more manipulative and coercive in terms of trying to bring women into line and to try and indoctrinate young people through propaganda? So it takes us back to that question: was the regime based upon popular support? Were people happy with what the Nazis were doing, or was it based on coercion and terror and propaganda? And there's definitely an element of both of these things, and maybe you could even say even more so the latter, terror, coercion and propaganda, when we start to look at how women were treated and how young people were treated. So, if the Nazis were to build their Volksgemeinschaft, what would be the role of women? What would women contribute to the Nazi regime? 2 points here, and I guess you shouldn't be surprised by what you see here, right? That the Nazis had this very traditional interpretation of how women should behave, and that is the idea, first and foremost, that women should be able to reproduce and have as many children as possible. That is what is outlined in this source here. If I just click on it, this very first source from Hitler, this is Hitler's attitudes towards women. He had mentioned in Mein Kampf kind of what his attitudes towards women should be, but he sees them really as being the carer, the traditional role. And what Hitler does, this is a little speech extract from 1934, what Hitler does is he tries to remove any negative association with childbirth from women. He wants to see having lots of children as being something which is highly valued within Nazi Germany rather than being devalued. So you weren't just a mother, you were a very important mother. You were not just reproducing for your family, but for the entire nation. So Hitler, you could say cleverly, but this is really just a piece of propaganda, right, that you see here, tries to portray women as being almost like a female army, right? And they're going into battle, but the battle that they are having is the battle of increasing the population. Why was an increased population so important to the Nazis? Well, as you can imagine, the kind of virility and strength of a nation in the 1930s was often determined by or shaped by whether or not the population was growing. Population is growing, the country is progressing and moving in the right direction. And we will look at some statistics later on which will show you whether or not this Nazi idea or policy of trying to increase the population works or not. But you can maybe identify the sinister element to this. If the Nazis see themselves as the Germans are going to be a warring nation for the future, then the more people you have, the more soldiers you have. And Hitler was talking about 1,000-year Reich, so maybe perpetual war was something that the Nazis had to prepare for, and the more men you've got, the more you can sustain losses. So that's the kind of first point. Now the second thing to look at here is number 4, which is linked to this idea of women having their place within the Volksgemeinschaft valued highly, and we can see the examples here in number 4 of awards or rewards given to women who had so many children. And if you did have 8 children, you would receive a gold medal, right, or the Gold Mother's Cross, right? The Nazis borrowed an idea from the United States in the 1920s, the idea of Mother's Day, and therefore in the 1930s in Germany, on Mother's Day, those women who had had 4 kids get bronze, 6 kids silver, and 8 children received a gold medal. This was something that people could wear out, women could wear out in public, and it would be something that they could, I guess, be proud of. In fact, Hitler Youth members had to basically stop and salute women who would wear the gold cross. So, very simple piece of Nazi propaganda, which was an attempt to kind of bring women into the Volksgemeinschaft and make them feel part of the regime. Because many women were kind of asked to give up their job and their careers when the Nazis came to power. The other reward, if you like, can be seen in number 2. If you did have 4 children, not only did you receive a bronze medal, but you were also given dispensation for any loans, family loans that you had taken out from the state. So if you got married in 1933, in an attempt to encourage people to get married, because the Nazis knew more people married equals more kids, the younger you get married, the more kids you'll have over a lifetime. The Nazis said, we'll give you a loan, and this loan of 1,000 Reichsmarks would not have to be paid back once you had 4 children. So the incentive was, you've got 3 kids, just have that extra one, and you save yourself this money. So again, another kind of a piece of policy, but also an element of propaganda here as well. But you can maybe see why some people decide to get married in 1933 because of the financial benefits that come with it. Number 3 on the list is the Nazi view of what was expected of women as they were looking for a spouse, as they were looking for the perfect husband. And these are kind of interesting because they give us a little insight into how the Nazis believed that women should look. So we're starting to see a control element here. This is now a question of, did the Nazi state benefit the lives of women? And women might say yes, but at the same time, are women conscious of the fact that the Nazis are trying to control them? Now, I should say that not all Nazis had the same view, right? In fact, Joseph Goebbels, leading propagandist in Germany, one of the top members of the party, he doesn't necessarily share these views, right? So, for example, he might disagree with this idea that women should kind of keep their bodies pure and not wear makeup and keep their hair looking a certain way. He actually quite liked the idea, partly because he was a philanderer, right? He quite liked the idea of women looking in a certain kind of glamorous way, and he was quite happy for women to attend, nightclubs in Berlin and so on. But that was something maybe that the Nazi elites could maybe focus on and talk about. But in terms of the whole population, there was a sense that women should still kind of follow certain traditional gender stereotypical views and should not, be your kind of urban socialites in terms of how they act and behave and look. So women were told not to drink, not to smoke, to marry for love, to know about the kind of racial and genetic purity, if you like, of the individuals that they should marry, and that's all listed in these 10 commandments for the choice of a spouse. We don't know how many prospective married couples actually took into account, these ideas before they decided to get hitched. Very quickly on to the other source. Here you can see, if you look at the top table population statistics, if you look at the 1933 statistic, you will see that marriages are 638,000, so they have jumped up by over 100,000 from 1932. Also, these are important years because this is the period between the Nazis not being in power and in 1933 they have been in power. But they go up in 1934, but then they don't dramatically go up that much more until 1939. And then if you look at the same time, divorces weirdly go up. So although the Nazis on the one hand are saying we are very much in favour of the family and church and conservative ideas, you can actually see here that the family is being broken up by increased divorce rates, possibly because so many women are seeing that their husbands are doing as they please in their attempts to increase the birth rate. And Goebbels is a good example of someone who had numerous affairs, although his wife did stay loyal to him. But then you can see the birth rate. So with an increase in marriages, you see an increase in children being born. So in 1933, we see 971,000 live births. By the time we get to the outbreak of the Second World War, that's up by roughly 500,000. So it's not a dramatic increase, but it is an increase, and it's partly to do with how the Nazis are encouraging people to behave differently, encouraging women to behave differently more than anything else. I should say one last thing, that women were not just expected to kind of reproduce, but they were expected to look after the male. In fact, the term is often referred to as the three Ks: the Kinder, children; Kirche, church; and Küchen, which is kitchen. So women were, yes, they have children, but look after those children. If they want to do anything in terms of having some type of public life, they could do some charity work around their church. That was the idea. And then the final one, Küchen, obviously refers to kitchen. Women were to be the homemaker. So on the one hand, we can see the Nazis really trying to create a scenario where women live a very rigid life controlled by the state. And that is what marks Germany out in the 1930s from so-called democracies like Britain and France and America. But we should say that 1930s America and 1930s Britain are not that different in terms of how women were viewed and how women were expected to behave. I guess the difference is that women were not being told how to look and how to act formally by the state in Britain. I guess in Britain what you get is a more kind of general view that, you know, social norms expect women to behave and act in certain ways. Within Germany you're getting something which is more like the state telling you exactly what you should and shouldn't do. And here's a propaganda poster, very typical Nazi propaganda poster, which focuses on the caring, nurturing mother. Now, there's one other additional thing that I want to talk about regarding the Nazis' relationship with women. And this article here is on My City, so you can look at it in your own time. I'm not going to go through it right now. But as you read through the article, more so not this page, but the second page, this article by Chara Gupta looks at how the Nazis tried to control the bodies of women during the regime. And things like sterilisation and abortion are examples of the Nazis controlling female bodies and women having no choice. So for example, you couldn't have an abortion, right? 1933 laws forbid abortion. If a woman was deemed to be genetically inferior, then she would be sterilised. She could never have kids. That is a real kind of depressing thought for some women, and some women were mentally affected by the way that the Nazis impinged upon their personal space, their actual bodies. So I do think, if you have the time, if you want to explore this in more detail, I do think there's some value and merit in watching the little video clip that you can get in the Sway presentation. Obviously you can't access it through the video, but you can access it via the Sway presentation on My City. And question 10 is a really kind of key question. Did women lose control of their bodies in Nazi Germany? And I think the answer to that question is definitely yes. Now, let's then think about this bigger question, right? Did women benefit from Nazi rule? Well, if that woman voted Nazi, if that woman gets married, if that woman has 4 kids, if that woman's husband has got a good job, then you're going to see women thinking that this is good. You know, crime is down, husband's got a job, there's plenty of food on the table, you can go holidays as part of the KDF movement, all is good. But if you're a woman who's been directly affected by Nazi racial policy, and by racial policy I mean you cannot have a child if that child is potentially going to be in some form mentally or physically disabled, then you're going to start to have an issue with the state. There is a link for the video if you do watch this via this way. And in addition to that, I mentioned this earlier on, not all women were supporters of Nazism, right? Because it's not as if in 1932 women who hated the Nazis in 1933 started to become real supporters of the regime. Here I've given you a little image of the emancipation of Ravensbrück concentration camp, situated in Germany. It was a concentration camp primarily for women. Now towards the end of the war, lots of Jewish women end up in Ravensbrück. But before that, women who would end up in Ravensbrück could be socialists or communists, maybe Catholic opponents of the regime, but also women who were seen to be asocial, who were not part of Germany, who could not be part of the Volksgemeinschaft. These are women who might be lesbian, or women who may have had an occupation in the kind of area of prostitution, they would be sent to concentration camps. And therefore, you need a more nuanced answer to any question that says, did women benefit from the Nazi regime? Unless you want to take that kind of extreme view and say, of course they didn't, because even the ones who did were suffering from some type of gender false consciousness. They were being manipulated by the Nazis. And let's face it, Nazi Germany was a patriarchy, pure and simple. So you can take your own position on how women were treated, perhaps based on your own ideological views. Okay, let's move on to the second group that I was going to touch on today, and that is youth. Did young people benefit from rule in the Nazi state? So once again, sources, more sources actually this time, but I want to kind of maybe just point out two things at this stage. Young people, as I mentioned, are kind of a blank slate for the Nazis. Nazis can mould and shape them in ways that they couldn't mould or shape people in their 30s or their 40s, people who already had clearly established political views and opinions. And the Nazis kind of accepted that. They knew they were never really going to change the views of the working class, who had never voted for Nazi, as you know from previous lessons. But children were different. Even if they were working class children, you could maybe intimidate the parents by the parents thinking that they have to be very cautious about what they say around their kids, because their kids are getting a lot of their information, a lot of their values imposed upon them, not necessarily from the home, and maybe not even from the church, but from two places. One, the education system, and two, the Hitler Youth movement. So the Nazis had two opportunities to indoctrinate and influence young people. If the schools didn't get you, the Hitler Youth certainly would. In fact, the Hitler Youth was the best place to indoctrinate kids, because even the schools couldn't quite be trusted, and that's in spite of the fact that when the Nazis came to power, in the first year or so, they did their best to remove as many teachers as possible who could be potentially regarded as undesirable people to teach the kind of Germany's future generation. In fact, 60% of lecturers in colleges were dismissed within the first year, and that is possibly because these college lecturers may have had a Marxist background. Now, young people were obviously in the school system going to receive an education that was a Nazi education. It would take time, right, for this to happen. The Nazis couldn't all of a sudden in 1933 come up with Nazi textbooks, but over the course of a few years, a Nazi curriculum would be put in place, right? This first document I want to show you is a Nazi curriculum for history. Now, once you have got control of history, you've really got control over people's understanding of the past, and you can start to shape how people will think about the future. So this is a Nazi history curriculum. On the left hand side you've got the amount of weeks, and then you've got the subjects that are being studied on, but then in the middle column you get how history, and we're talking about very recent history for the Nazis at this point, or for the German people at this point, how the Jews should be related to each of these events. So if you just take one example, for example, week 9 to 12, right, we spoke about this before, the idea of Germany kind of being forced out of the First World War. Well, what was the reason for that? Well, because they had been encircled. Who was responsible for Germany's encirclement? Not Britain, not France, not Russia, but the Jews in this interpretation. And then you see the same thing repeating itself: Jews to blame for the defeat during World War I, Jews to blame for the idea of the stab in the back legend that we've spoke about, Jews to blame for Versailles, and so on. And this type of curriculum would be eventually found across Germany, and young people therefore are going to start to interpret recent historical events as being largely the fault of the Jews. This will make the persecution of the Jews much more straightforward. Next point to focus on is what did Hitler expect from his young people? He really did expect young males in particular to become almost like kind of hard and hardened in such a way where they don't really show much emotion, that they have to have physical strength. And again, the sinister element to this is that they should be being prepared for a future war. He wanted his kids basically to be strong and hard and tough. How would this be achieved? Well, the Hitler Youth was the place that this would happen. So we know that young females have got a certain pathway in life, right? That's not going to deviate, that's the pathway towards motherhood. For young men, they were expected to be, where possible, physically fit and mentally fit. By mentally fit, we're not talking about them learning about, philosophy or the sciences or history or anything like that, but he wants his young males to be aware of their biological, racial strengths, if you like. So, one of the most important subjects in schools for the Nazis would be physical exercise, PE. That would be much more important than, let's say, something like philosophy or history. And the Nazis truly believed that they could shape the future generation either through the Hitler Youth, with Hitler always being the main figure that these young men were to kind of live up to, or through the education system. Now, as I kind of touched on earlier, there was this sense that indoctrination can take place through the education system, and it definitely can, right? It can take place in the most obvious ways, as you can see in this picture in the top right hand corner, by depicting the Jews as degenerate, kind of perverted character who's trying to exploit this young female in the image. And this was an image that you would find in kids' school books. So it's going from a very early age, make young Germans cautious of Jews. And not just cautious, but racist towards Jews. The second element of Nazi education that could lead to indoctrination can be found in subjects that were taught, any subject, so whether it be language or history or geography or chemistry, as source F tells us. The idea was to always kind of concentrate any example with an attempt to kind of tailor that example in such a way that it would be beneficial to the Nazi regime. I'm going to read out an example to you. These examples that I'm going to read come from the historians that you can access via My City, right? There's a PDF on what I'm about to read from on my City, and this from a book called Nazism, State, Economy and Society. And in this little example I'm going to read from, this primary source, you'll see the point I'm making, right? So this is an exam question, and the question says, question 95, the construction of a lunatic asylum cost 6 million Reichsmarks. How many houses at 15,000 Reichsmarks could each could have been built for that amount, right? So the question is a mathematics question, but it's more than just a mathematics question, isn't it? It's a question that's saying, well, do you know what? See, if we didn't have to build lunatic asylums, more money could go towards building houses for ordinary Germans. What should we do with people who should be in lunatic asylums? Well, that is a question that Nazis would eventually get to, right? That's part of their 1938 voluntary euthanasia scheme, sometimes known as the T4 programme, where the Nazis really kind of began that process of killing people who were healthy, but not healthy enough for the Nazis. These were people who were mentally unfit or mentally unstable, and the Nazis did not want these people within the German state because they undermined the purity of the German race. And that is when we start to obviously realise and recognise that the Nazis and the ideas of Hitler and the anti-Semites within the party, we start to realise how dangerous a movement they actually were. There's many of these types of questions that could be found in exams. Here's another one, for example, question 97, to keep a mentally ill person cost approximately 4 Reichsmarks. To keep a cripple, obviously Nazis 1930 language, 50 Reichsmarks, a criminal 350, and then it says but only 4 Reichsmarks is given to civil servants who work hard, or 350 Reichsmarks to white collar workers, or maybe even only 2 Reichsmarks for unskilled workers. Again, it raises the question, how could the lives be of these hard working Germans be improved if we didn't have criminals or disabled people or mentally ill people? And then these examples carry on and on. And some of the questions in, let's say, for example, chemistry or maths would also be related to war and dropping bombs, and you'd have to make calculations. Again, it was trying to make the idea of war normal. This is a normalisation of war and the normalisation of the mistreatment of those who were deemed to be unfit for Germany. Now, I want to just touch on one final group, right, and you can see this in the final source here, and that is teachers themselves. Did teachers, let's say we go back to that initial question, right, did certain groups benefit from Nazi rule? And we go back to the very first class we had when we looked very, very briefly at the middle class. Did the middle classes benefit from the Nazi regime? Now remember, the middle classes were more likely to vote Nazi than anybody else. Now, we haven't touched on the middle classes yet, apart from maybe a little extract that you read from Bergen, in terms of, salaries increased, and that probably improved the status of the middle classes again, and they felt, that Nazi Germany was working for them. But if we accept that most teachers were middle class, did they benefit from the regime? Well, not necessarily, right? If you were a teacher and let's say you were an avid Nazi, you could join the Nazis Teachers League, right? It's known as the NSLB. And if you joined this Nazi Teachers League, you could, you could get the odd perk here and there. But ultimately, what you're seeing is you're being controlled by the state. Now, I accept that teachers are always, to some extent, answerable to the state or state authorities that run education. But in Nazi Germany, it seems to go beyond that. It seems to go, or does go beyond that. It goes too far, and teachers start to kind of kick back. So, for example, it was expected. This is again from the book that I was just talking about, right, from Jeremy Noakes. There's an extract that you can read on my site that talks about how teachers were kind of forced to go to camps. There was teacher camps. They would sometimes last for a week or 2 weeks. And when they went to these teacher camps, the teachers really were being indoctrinated and told how to then indoctrinate kids, right? And they were expected to wear uniforms and take on field exercise and sing songs and go to lectures and have discussions and play sports and march and eat together. And all this was going on within the camp to try and create some type of camaraderie and solidarity amongst Nazi teachers. But teachers, didn't truly think they were benefiting from the regime. If you think about how it started, teachers were not doing well under the Weimar Republic because of the economic depression. So anything that the Nazis do to solidify and stabilise the education system, and then anything they do to maybe improve wages, that's going to be seen as a bonus or a benefit. But then as time progresses, teachers start to think that wages aren't going up enough. They start to think that there's too much interference, especially from the Hitler Youth. And on page 430 of the PDF that's on my site, you actually get a little insight. This is from 1939, so we're 6 years into the Nazi regime. A little insight in how teachers are thinking, and there's almost an assumption, or an assertion, I should say, that teachers are trying to undermine the Hitler Youth movement by giving out too much homework to kids, or giving kids homework on the nights when they should be going to their local Hitler Youth kind of event. And that's because teachers felt that they were constantly being watched, not just by the Education Ministry, but also by the Hitler Youth movement as well, and by Hitler Youth leaders. So teachers, as an example of a kind of archetypal middle class occupation, do they really benefit from the regime? Again, you get a nuanced answer to that question. On one hand, yes, and on the other hand, no. If you look at young people, do young people truly benefit from the Hitler Youth? Do they benefit from the education system? The point here is they think they do because they don't really know anything else, unless they've got a parent who's adamant that the Nazi regime is bad, and that parent is quietly telling them that. Then kids are really open to suggestion. And the Hitler Youth movement was appealing, clubs, outdoor events, camping trips. You can see why the young boys, young males would be attracted to some of this. And eventually the Hitler Youth becomes compulsory, and there's very little way out of it. There were some groups who refused to join the Hitler Youth. They are sometimes referred to as the Edelweiss Pirates, or pirate groups, and they would not dress in Hitler Youth uniforms. They would dress like regular teenagers, and they would drink and they would smoke and they would play music and they would fight with the Hitler Youth, but at great cost, because many of them would eventually be arrested. In fact, in Cologne during the war, some of these members of the pirate groups were publicly hanged. So the cost of not being part of the Hitler Youth could be grave. So Where do you kind of find the evidence that would suggest that kids had been manipulated? Well, there is an online video that you can watch on the Hitler Youth that is on My City, and you can again just try and answer that question: did young people benefit or not benefit from the regime? And again, you have to really take into account propaganda when addressing that point. Okay, that really is all we have to focus on for this lesson. I guess it's just a matter of thinking about the two kind of key questions and trying to kind of come up with evidence to support the claims that sometimes it's about popular support, but sometimes it's about coercion and terror and propaganda as well. Okay, thank you.